Prelude, the sacred nod. Japan is a land of earthquakes, unpredictable and devastating. Sometimes the ground gently shudders, a last slipping of unseen forces deep below the surface. Rarely noticed by everyday people, such quivers can be passed off as the wind simply rustling the branches of a tree. This was such a day. Only those closest to the epicenter felt the tremor that would lead to a cataclysm unlike anything the world had ever seen. December 1st, 1941. The Imperial Palace, Tokyo, Japan. The weight of 73 million souls pressed onto the shoulders of the 42-year-old Emperor Hirohito. The boyish leader, with his sparse moustache and glasses, sat motionless on a raised platform backed by a gilded screen before the highest leaders of Japan. He exuded unquestioned authority in his navy blue uniform, replete with medals, a braid, and adorned with a sash across his chest. Without emotion, he contemplated the petitions and reasonings of 19 of his most trusted military and civil officials, separated before him at 2 long tables facing each other, each table perfectly draped with floor-length burgundy fabric patterned with gold. From Hirohito's earliest memories, he had been saturated with the understanding that he was born not only the military and political leader of Japan, but their spiritual leader as well, a living god to whom his subjects owed absolute obedience. He watched intently as Prime Minister Major General Hideki Tojo rose from his seat, the silence pierced by the jangle of his medals and the squeak of his chair as it slid back on the parquet floor. Tojo bowed deeply, then stood upright. Only a month earlier, his iconic visage appeared worldwide on the cover of Time magazine, bald head, broad moustache, and black round-rimmed glasses. Officers and soldiers alike knew him as the Razor, as much for his quick wit and decision-making as for his brutal military prowess. He patted his forehead with a handkerchief and pushed back his glasses. "Your Majesty," he began, "you have heard the words of each of your advisers and commanders in this room. At the moment, our empire stands at the threshold of glory or oblivion. We tremble with fear in the presence of His Majesty." The Emperor knew full well why Tojo perspired, for he too was haunted by the recent report from an elite group of researchers who had delivered their unanimous conclusion that Japan could not sustain its war with China for more than 5 years and could never win a war with the United States, whose manufacturing capacity was 12 times that of Japan. Although he had dismissed the report and was supremely confident in Japan's military preeminence, he was left unsettled by the communiqué. Beginning a chess match with merely 2 pieces would yield better odds than starting a war with the United States of America. Tojo's eyes turned downward. "We subjects are keenly aware of the great responsibility we must assume from this point forward." The break of eye contact released the Emperor to look upwards at the dark coffered ceiling that permeated his council chamber with the scent of ancient wood. A final decision had to be made, and he knew it was his, alone to make. Once the diver left the cliff, there could be no return. The outcome of a war with the United States could be disastrous, yet the apple on the tree was enticing. Germany had swept across Europe in a blitzkrieg, virtually unopposed, and was now battering the doors of Moscow. Japan had allied itself with Germany and Italy and had no misgivings that the Germans would be the ultimate victors of a European war that was all but over. This wasn't the time to hesitate and get left behind. Hirohito unconsciously tapped his fingers in succession against the end of his armrest. He and his leaders had been furiously constructing a colossal military machine, while the US sat on the sidelines, bogged down by internal dissent as its outdated military deteriorated under a poor economy and the indecision of Washington. His nation was in the best position it had ever been in, or perhaps would ever be in, to establish its dominance over the Pacific and East Asia. Japan was at its strongest, and America at its weakest. The Empire of Japan was finally poised for conquest and to secure its place in history. "Once His Majesty reaches a decision to commence hostilities," Tojo said, We will all strive to repay our obligations to him, to bring the government and the military ever closer together, to resolve that the nation united will go to victory, to make an all-out effort to achieve our war aims, and to set His Majesty's mind at ease." Tojo remained standing as all eyes in the chamber turned slowly toward the Emperor, waiting. At times Hirohito entered into the conversation, but at other times he restrained himself from uttering a single word during the entire meeting. Such was the case on this occasion. Ever so slightly, he nodded with a crooked smile, and his feet left the cliff as he fell weightlessly toward the water far below. The precarious question of victory remained, but the pursuit of the answer was undeniable. Millions would perish. December 8th, 1941, Japan time. Early a.m. before the dawn. The Pacific Ocean, several hundred miles north of Hawaii. In the black of night, the Kido Butai smashed through the heavy seas at full speed due south. The Kido Butai, the carrier battle group, was the world's newest and most powerful naval fleet. 6 carriers tightly packed with 414 attack aircraft, 2 battleships, 20 escort ships, and 23 submarines. The massive Akagi, equipped with 2 levels of hangars housing 91 planes, was the largest aircraft carrier the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever built at the time, and was the flagship of the First Air Fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a meticulous planner, cautious to a fault. Salt mist and the smell of aviation fuel hung in the air of the hangars as engineers in white jumpsuits feverishly unlashed aircraft from their moorings on the floor, unchocked the wheels of fighters and bombers, and began transferring aircraft to elevators to be raised to the dark flight deck. The steel hull gave a haunting screech as it twisted from the pounding waves. Engineers hitched 18-foot torpedoes to the bellies of Nakajima B-5Ns and 1,760-pound armor-piercing bombs to others. Aichi D-3A dive bombers were fitted with 550-pound bombs, while the Mitsubishi Zero fighters were fed thousands of rounds of ammunition. In an organized frenzy, engineers coaxed the aircraft into position onto waiting elevators. Planes began to fill the breezy deck, each engine coughing clouds of smoke and snorting blue flames from their exhaust pipes, rumbling to join the deafening thunder of a storm about to break. At the front of the low-ceilinged briefing room, crammed with men anxious for a fight, stood the senior flight commander of the First Air Fleet, 1st Carrier Division, the pilot who would lead the historic attack, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. With his hands behind his back, facing his airmen seated and leaning against grey walls, Fuchida stood proudly in his dark brown jumpsuit, trimmed with a fur collar and overlaid with a brown kapok-filled float vest. He had a narrow, dense moustache. Having anticipated this day for months, today his joy mixed with the sparkle in his eyes and the adrenaline in his veins. "In the event we fail to destroy the aircraft on the ground," Fuchida announced, "or we lose the element of surprise, I will give the signal for the dive bombers to begin the attack. Otherwise, the torpedo bombers will initiate, as planned." He scanned the faces of the torpedo pilots who nodded. He had longed and dreamed for this day of vindication before the eyes of the world. Off to his side stood his fleet commander, the rather stocky Vice Admiral Nagumo, and beside him, Fuchida's longtime best friend and chief planner of the impending attack, Lieutenant Minoru Genda in his officer's uniform, strikingly handsome. A blackboard behind him displayed flight paths to islands, his last-minute details and exhortations of, "As the gods have given us victory in the past, so will they give us victory in the future. And win or lose, you will fight and die for your country." As the idling planes rumbled outside the door and their ship rose and fell in the turbulent sea, Fuchida sensed a powerful mixture of fatherly pride and deep compassion for the 146 young airmen before him. Men he knew by name, men he had personally trained, all of them eager, restless, serious, some whose mothers would weep when the day was over. Under any other circumstances he would have forbidden his flyers from taking off in such stormy seas, but such was their destiny. Years of training and careful planning have brought us to this moment in time. He paused to let his eyes penetrate into the hearts of his flyers, then snatched his soft leather flight helmet from the table, pulled it over his head, and adjusted the goggles above his forehead. Our duty is not only to protect the untarnished past of our ancestors, but to annihilate the enemies of Japan and to establish a new order for the future, the imperial way. Passion and zeal energized his body as he paced like a tiger eyeing an open cage door. This is our day, today, our opportunity to mark our place in history. The world will soon know that we are the new samurai. The Empire's fate depends on the result of this battle. Let every man do his utmost. He snapped to attention and threw both arms to the sky as the men leapt to their feet, then led his warriors into a resounding cheer. Tenno Heika! Banzai! 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 To the east, the dark blue sky glowed orange along the ocean horizon with the morning light. Engineers sprinted between aircraft on the wind-blown deck as pilots and flight crews clambered into their idling planes. Shuffling through a crowded passageway, Fuchida stared distantly at the floor as he fastened his chin strap and scoured his mind for any details he may have overlooked. Glancing up, he was wakened from his thoughts by Genda's face, his best friend. Airmen eased past them toward the angry chorus of attack planes. Fuchida lowered his hands and gazed far into Genda's eyes. This was it. There was no turning back. 18 years earlier, spring 1923. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, Itajima Island, Hiroshima, Japan. Light burst through the morning clouds in a stunning array of columns. It shone above a steep, densely green mountain ridge behind the long two-story red brick building of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy. A rising sun flag flapped loosely out front in a morning ocean breeze. Shirtless, barefoot cadets in white pants jogged past the young, clean-shaven Fuchida and Genda in their blue uniforms on their way to class. Fuchida breathed in the morning hope. A new day. He studied the brick structure and reflected on the strange fact that each brick had been individually wrapped in paper and shipped 30,000 miles from their naval mentor, Great Britain. Then he stopped when he noticed the startling sunburst in the sky that morning, strikingly similar to Japan's own naval flag. "The sun rises on you, Fuchi," Genda said. Fuchida contemplated the sunlight piercing the clouds, then looked back at Genda with a smirk. "It's only morning. Just wait until the afternoon." The two quickly converged with other cadets past meticulously manicured pine trees up the stone steps into the brick building. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy was for the elite, those being groomed for leadership in the growing naval force of Japan. Fuchida was exceptionally bright, if not a bit impulsive and cocky, a hands-on type of man and, above all, passionate for his country. Genda possessed an equally sharp intellect, but leaned more to the strategic side of things. He strove to do things better than anyone else. Fuchida, now 22, walked through the hallway among his classmates with a slight swagger that he'd earned. Mocked as a child by his classmates for his small size and shy demeanour, he had determined to prove them wrong. He didn't feel lucky. He'd worked hard for his place, a place even his own friends and family never thought he'd arrive at. Despite failing both the physical and academic examinations on his first attempt, he spent hours swimming, studying late into the night and running, mercilessly disciplining himself in order to pass them both, which he did, gaining acceptance into the premier academy of the nation, an exclusive club. He'd paid his dues with sweat and sheer force of will and remained near the top of his class. Inside the schoolroom, young cadets took notes and cocked their heads to the words of their professor, Lieutenant Nakahama. Maps, charts, and ship illustrations adorned the walls. Writing and diagrams filled the front blackboard. Submarines, destroyers, and now aircraft from our new carriers all lend their support to the heart of our fleet, our battleships. He smacked his pointer onto a large profile of Japan's newest battleship, the Mutsu. Fuchida had studied her well. She was less than a year old, armed with 8 massive guns which hurled 1-ton shells over 23 miles, 43,000 tons of modern military power, the pride of the Imperial Navy. Lieutenant Nakahama gently laid the pointer across his desk and began to pace the perimeter of the classroom. Continuing from yesterday, following the Great War in 1919, a convention was held in Paris to form the League of Nations, and for the first time Japan was recognized and invited as a great world power. But was the League truly an organization for world peace, or just another means for Anglo-Saxon nations to extend their own power and influence? Fuchida's eyes followed the professor to the side of the room as he adjusted the angle of the blinds. To clarify things, Japan offered the racial equality proposal, which simply declared that all members be given equal and just treatment without regard to race or nationality. Despite the protests of some who declared that a coloured person could never be equal to a white European, the proposal passed by a majority of votes, only to be set aside and defeated, when it was decided that an issue of this level had to be unanimous. Do you know who made that decision? Fuchida quickly raised his hand, and the professor nodded. Sir, wasn't that by President Woodrow Wilson? Indeed, the chairman of the committee, President Wilson of the United States. Fuchida glanced over at Genda with hidden disgust as Lieutenant Nakahama completed his circuit to the front of the class. Japan was invited to dinner, yes, but then given no place to sit. He scanned across the faces of the cadets. In the end, it was just as well that the proposal was defeated. The Yamato race has no equal on Earth, unconquered for 2,600 years. For a moment the professor and Fuchida caught eyes, connected, and exchanged the slightest of smiles. Itajima Island sits about 3 miles due south of Hiroshima, a major city near the southwestern end of the main island of Honshu. The island spans about 6 miles across at its widest, and was about 9 miles long with a wide inland bay, perfect for docking ships, boats, and seaplanes. The academy was built near the water's edge, which is where Fuchida found himself the following morning. The rumbling engines of a pair of gigantic idling flying boats nearly drowned out the instructions shouted by the officer, as Fuchida, Genda, and the class of cadets huddled closely and strained to listen. These Felixstowe F-5 biplanes were built in England and have a wingspan of over 100 feet, outfitted with 2 Rolls-Royce engines. Each engine produces 345 horsepower. Fuchida pressed nearer to the front and glanced enviously at the pilot in the open cockpit. The instructor shouted on. Now, are there any among you who might aspire to become a— Hi! Fuchida shot up his hand without thinking. It had never crossed his mind to be a pilot, but the simple thrill of seeing the graceful aircraft taking off and landing in the bay sparked his desire for adventure. Fuchida, hurry! As Fuchida squeezed through the herd, Genda gave him an envious swat on the back as an officer escorted him to the aircraft. After gingerly climbing up the side of the aircraft and plopping down in a back seat, one of the 4 places in the nose of the open-air cockpit, he clumsily strapped on a pair of goggles and buckled himself in. Attendants shoved the idling plane from the dock, and Fuchida gave Genda a thumbs up, who responded with the same. The engines wound into a thunderous roar, the vibrations sending a chill of exhilaration through Fuchida's body, and the huge bird sped and skipped across the water as it accelerated, its engines straining until it skimmed off into the sky. Fuchida was in heaven. Circling the island and passing over the academy, the flight gave Fuchida the opportunity to wave wildly to the cadets below and take in an expansive view of the land he'd never experienced before. Between long views studying the ground, he examined every feature of the cockpit as if he'd just bought the plane for himself. He kept asking himself, what do I need to do to be able to fly one of these? Afterwards, Fuchida and Genda talked about the day like little kids over a newfound toy. Fuchida beamed. Maybe the Navy is about ships, but one day I'm going to be a pilot. That's what I'm going to be. "I'll drink to that. On me," Genda replied, who was equally committed to a career in aircraft. Aircraft are the future of the Navy. Their paths had become one. The Naval Academy was built on Itajima Island for good reasons. It was near the shore naval base of Kure, which was home to massive shipyards, and near Hiroshima, a military centre as well. But the school also wanted to keep the underclassmen and officers separated from society as much as possible to immerse them in military life. In celebration of their new dream of becoming pilots, Fuchida invited Genda on a rare outing to Hiroshima. In the crisp evening air, they stood out from the crowds in their blue officers' uniforms as they strode down the busy sidewalks under wooden buildings plastered with signs and trimmed with gaudy lights. "But we only had 4 battleships," Fuchida said, "and Russia had, I think, 11, so don't you think it was our training that led to victory at Tsushima?" "We also had nearly 50 cruisers and destroyers to their 16, Genda replied, "so that was a big factor as well. But Admiral Togo," Genda shook his head, "he's a naval genius. He's the one who really handed us that victory. Togo, a pure warrior." The two came to a halt as Fuchida stared at a pair of attractive young girls in kimonos who passed by from the opposite direction, chatting on, oblivious to the fixed gaze of their admirers. After a slight pause, Genda asked, "So, Fuchi, what's more exciting, airplanes or girls?" Fuchida took a long pull on his cigarette. "I suppose it depends on which I'm closest to. Pilots control planes, but then girls control pilots." Genda smirked and put his arm around Fuchida as they continued walking. "Let me take you to that bar I was talking about. They've got a drink with 3 flavours that'll set your tongue on fire. You'll really like it." As they made their way down the sidewalk, Fuchida paused to look up at a tall stone church, his eyes seeming to search for something in particular. He unconsciously slid Genda's arm off his shoulder. "You know, that would be a perfect place for an enemy lookout. If I had my way, I'd tear those buildings down." "You think so? Westerners, dividing our people's loyalty with their foreign god. Those people can't be trusted." He bristled with the intrusion of the beliefs of any other people than that of his homeland. Not particularly spiritual, but having been brought up with Buddhist and Shinto teachings, he was most offended by outsiders trespassing on his homeland, foreigners and spies. "No one should be called Great Master, but the Emperor alone." Fuchida took a last puff of his cigarette while studying an elderly man gently escorting his wife up the stone steps to the church. "One day our empire will rise up while this old building and everything it stands for will crumble to rubble and ash." He glanced over to Genda as he exhaled a cloud of smoke, then flicked his cigarette butt at the church, giving one last look up and down at the old stone building, shook his head, and walked on. September 3rd, 1923. Kanto Gakuin University, Yokohama, Japan. With sleeves rolled up and his hands on his hips, Jimmy Koval, a 27-year-old American, stood in disbelief before a smouldering heap of broken concrete and steel, once a building. Clouds of smoke wafted by as 2 Japanese men trotted past with shovels and wooden buckets. He slid off his smudged, round-rimmed glasses and rubbed them on his rolled-up sleeve, wiped his forehead with the back of his arm, and put his glasses back on. It had been a long day already, yet it had just begun. "Has everyone been accounted for? Is anyone missing?" he inquired in English to the Japanese teacher beside him. "We're still checking. Sasaki and Ohashi were killed by the collapse along with a helper named Kaneko." Jimmy hung his head. He knew them all, but felt there was no time for sorrow. He had to put it out of his mind for now. "But I think all of the students are okay. At least classes weren't in session." 2 days earlier, the Great Kanto earthquake had levelled the Tokyo-Yokohama area, killing nearly 150,000 people in violent tremors lasting nearly 10 minutes. Fires afterward completed the devastation. With both a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Rochester and a Master of Theology from Brown University, Jimmy had volunteered to join the Baptist Overseas Mission Society 3 years earlier. They subsequently sent him as a teacher to the Kanto Gakuin School, founded in 1884 in downtown Yokohama, a sprawling industrial center southwest of Tokyo. "How about Dr. Sakata's house? Is he okay?" Jimmy asked. "We've still got some fires going. I don't know." Jimmy slung his rucksack over his shoulder and clambered up the hill past others rescuing books from the rubble. As he approached, enormous flames and billowing clouds of smoke erupted just beyond the ridge. Dr. Sakata stood passively watching the blaze among a small group of others, likewise helplessly watching the fire creep toward his wooden home. At 32, he was young for a school president. His taut face was adorned with a shallow, broad mustache. "Dr. Sakata, are you all right? Is your house okay?" Jimmy asked. Sakata shook his head. "I don't know. It's too hot to go in." He looked back at Jimmy head to toe. "How'd you get here from Tokyo? I thought the trains weren't running." "They aren't. I walked." Jimmy slid his pack off his shoulder and dug through it. He was relatively athletic, and the half-day walk wasn't much to him. "I bought some rice balls in town, which wasn't easy to do." He pulled out a paper bag and an envelope with some money he'd sacrificially scraped together and held them out to Dr. Sakata, who appeared puzzled. Jimmy opened the envelope to reveal the currency inside. "Oh no, I'm sorry," Sakata said as he turned away. "I couldn't accept this from you. You'll need this for yourself." Jimmy sighed at his American hospitality being blunted by Japanese propriety. "Now's not the time to be polite," Jimmy said. "Be practical." He forced the items into Dr. Sakata's hands. "The mission asked me to help at the train station downtown, so I need to leave now to get there before nightfall." He left the gifts with Dr. Sakata, who gave a short bow of thanks, then looked back at the fire. "We're going to figure how to hold classes in a few weeks, so stay in touch." Jimmy nodded, glanced up at the column of smoke, and turned away. As he approached downtown Yokohama in the late afternoon under a smoke-laden sky, the streets thronged with a river of people pouring out from the city, their backs strapped with what goods they could save. Many had sooty masks or rags tied to their faces as they fled. Others carted the moaning wounded and the silent dead. Angry clouds of smoke and ash obscured the surreal view of the few stone and brick buildings left standing. Jimmy curiously eyed a 4-story lone brick wall with empty window frames standing defiantly among the smouldering rubble. "Excuse me, please, do you have any water?" a woman said in Japanese. Turning to the troubled voice, Jimmy saw a young woman with a baby boy fastened to her back, pleading to passers-by, who only gave rude glances and pushed on with the exodus. "Please! My husband is dead! Please, water! Someone!" Jostling through the mass of people, Jimmy made his way to the woman in her black-smudged pink kimono and attempted his best Japanese. "I have water!" She began to turn with a smile, then was taken aback, not expecting to see an American. Regaining herself, she smiled and gave a brief bow. Jimmy reached into his bag and felt for his canteen and continued in his clumsy Japanese, "I have water, more water and food at the train station." He prayed to God they had the water he'd heard about as he gave the canteen to the woman who clutched it and gulped the water. Jimmy gently stroked the hair of the content little boy on her back. The woman bowed again and spoke while panting from the long drink. "Thank you so very much." She shyly motioned to her son on her back with a quizzical look. Jimmy smiled and brought the canteen to the little boy's puckered mouth as the woman studied Jimmy's face. The boy was fascinatingly beautiful to him. He screwed the cap back on and motioned for the woman to follow him as he navigated upstream against the tide of the fleeing masses. "I take you to station. Come." One of the few structures to ignore the odds of destruction, the Yokohama train station stood intact when Jimmy and the distraught mother finally arrived near sunset, the dusk closing the sky with a melancholy reddish-brown. Having heard of food and waiter, thousands converged on the terminal lit by oil lamps. Uncooked bags of rice, sandwiches, and drinks of water were being snatched up as fast as the volunteers could hand them out. Each table displayed folded paper signs in English and Japanese that read, "Courtesy of the American Baptist Mission Society." Jimmy escorted the woman and child through the crowd to a group ladling water into whatever containers people held out. "Water for you and for beautiful child. Food, too. Sleep here tonight." He gave a short bow, and the woman reciprocated, only she held her bow and looked at the ground. "Why have you done this?" She paused while still in her bow. "I cannot repay my obligation to you." Jimmy was caught off guard and shook his head. "I give what Father in heaven first gives me. So no obligation to me, only to God. Thank him only, not me." The woman peered up, clearly touched. Jimmy smiled and rubbed the child on her back. "My wife and I have child coming, I understand." He, too, had to hold back his emotions. She smiled, nodded, and looked into Jimmy's face one last time, then blended into the line waiting for water. The volunteers were a mix of Japanese and Americans, young and old, men and women. Despite the desperation of the circumstances, those seeking relief seemed to cooperate graciously. Jimmy felt overwhelmed by the immense needs of the people and the paltry goods the mission had for so vast a crowd. But he knew he should try to help however he could. At least that's what he told his pregnant wife, Charma, 2 days earlier when he left northwestern Tokyo. As he came behind a table, a petite American female worker greeted him. "Hey, Jimmy, our house is nothing but a pile of sticks. The place was completely wrecked. I'm staying with friends now. How about you?" Jimmy handed out 2 bags of rice to an old woman who smiled, nodded, and said, "Arigatou gozaimasu." "Oh, our house in Tokyo survived the quake all right, but not the fires," Jimmy said. "The house is gone. We just have our clothes and our lives. 3 people at the school were killed, but the city... Wow. It's unbelievable." As an aftershock rocked the station, swaying the hanging oil lamps, the crowds froze and looked up with anxiety. The worker spoke softer under her breath. "A lot of folks are spreading rumours that Korean workers set the fires and then went and poisoned the wells." Jimmy shook his head and cautiously glanced around. He knew the Japanese wouldn't understand her English, but he wanted to see if anyone noticed. She reached back and grabbed another tray of rice bags. "Vigilante groups rounded up Koreans, beat them and killed them. Lots of them, some say hundreds." Jimmy stopped to look at her. "Who said that?" She turned her back to the tables. "I saw it myself. 5 or 6 Koreans tied to trees by a mob." Her voice began to tremble, and she held her hand to her mouth. Their noses were cut off, eyes gouged out, covered in blood, still breathing. "Good Lord! Where were the police?" Her eyes filled with tears. She looked back at Jimmy. "They were the ones beating them." The next morning, filthy and exhausted, Jimmy hiked back to the home where he and Charma were staying with friends, a place outside Tokyo on a narrow street lined with wooden homes packed together at the foot of a green mountain. Grateful for the fresh, smoke-free air, sheets on a clothesline fluttered in the wind as a dog barked at him. He glanced down at the wiry, yapping canine. "You have no idea, my friend." After taking off his shoes inside the doorway, he collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. His very pregnant wife, Charma, brought a bowl of noodles, being careful not to spill. "Where'd you stay last night? We were a bit worried." "Oh, at the station downtown," Jimmy mumbled. "I was so tired I could have slept on a pile of bricks, and there were lots of piles of bricks to choose from. I made it to the school the day before. It's an incredible mess. 3 people were killed in the collapse. I don't know exactly what happened." Jimmy blinked slowly. "But we're still going to open in a few weeks. I'm looking forward to teaching again." "The soup's hot. Give it a minute to—" Charmer winced in pain and turned her head. Jimmy jumped up. "No, no, no! Let me get that! You have enough on your hands, honey." Miriam, who owned the house with her husband, walked in with her chin up. "That's it, Charmer. No guests serve themselves in my house. I've got that." Charmer rolled her eyes as Jimmy helped her into a rather beaten-up easy chair. She took a deep breath and sighed. "You're so sweet," Charmer said. "Won't be long now. What do you think of Peggy?" "Well, Peggy's a fine name," Jimmy said as he squatted beside her and gently rubbed her belly. "But I thought you were giving us a boy." "Girls first, you know that." Jimmy took her hand and melodramatically kissed it. "Yes, indeed. How could I forget?" "Peggy." "It is." January 1925, San Francisco Bay. The biting wind ruffled the navy blue pants of Fuchida and Genda as they stood motionless in a crisp at-ease posture, hands behind their backs along the rail with the entire crew spaced evenly down the length of the cruiser Yakumo. 3 American warships escorted their ship and 2 other cruisers into the San Francisco Bay as seagulls called from above. Fuchida studied the stark white brand-new U.S. battleships, guns proudly cocked into the sky at their maximum angle, then wistfully glanced at their own aging Japanese cruisers breathing smoke from triple stacks. Maintaining his posture, Fuchida whispered to Genda, "Look at us in our old smoky rust buckets, and look at the West Virginia, the pride of the American fleet. It's humiliating." Having successfully graduated from the Naval Academy in the top of their class, Fuchida and Genda proceeded on a final training mission that took them to one of Japan's allies, the United States. Despite slowly building tensions, the 2 nations retained their relationship forged during the First World War. "Relax," Genda whispered back, likewise unmoving. "You have to ride an ox before you can ride a horse." Genda grinned. Fuchida smouldered. After their cruiser was moored alongside their host battleship, USS West Virginia, the Japanese captain briefed his cadets in the main mess area. "I'm sure you're looking forward to seeing the city and touring the American battleships. Just remember that America is still our ally. You represent the Emperor and all of Japan." Under a sunny sky with a chilly bay breeze, Captain Belknap personally gave the tour, speaking with great gestures on the forward deck of the battleship beneath one of the mammoth gun turrets. "And can fire a 2,200-pound shell up to 40,000 yards. That's 22 miles, considerably beyond the horizon." A Japanese cadet nodded and turned to his classmates to translate into Japanese. "It will fire a shell that is, 1,000 kilos, a distance of 22 miles. Fuchida whispered, I know. We have the same guns on our battleships, you idiot. Ask him about the float planes in the back. That's what I'm interested in." Later, they stood beneath the 3 float planes mounted on raised launch rails on the rear deck of the battleship. Vought UO-1 float planes, biplanes that were designed with a single large pontoon beneath the plane in the centre, with 2 smaller pontoons below the wingtips for stability. The aircraft were catapult-launched for reconnaissance missions, and then, upon returning, would land in the water to be recovered by winch and hauled back onto the ship. As the captain continued his talk, Fuchida elbowed Genda and whispered in Japanese, "They think of planes in terms of reconnaissance only. Why can't aircraft be used as attack vehicles? Why not?" "I was just thinking the same thing," Genda whispered back. "No plane's really been developed that's capable of attacking a capital ship effectively. It's never been tried. It seems foolish that even our aircraft carriers only launch scouts and fighters to protect the battleships and cruisers and to communicate shellfire adjustment on targets." "One day the carriers will rule the seas," Fuchida added, "attacking battleships that can never reach them. These big guns will be useless." Genda looked up at the float plane and back at Fuchida with a glint in his eye. The tour ended below decks in a cramped interior that exposed the inside hull of the ship. Captain Belknap crouched down and rapped the steel wall with his knuckles. Using the latest advances, we constructed a triple-layer hull with 16 inches of steel at the waterline. He stood upright, adjusted his hat, and put his hands on his hips. Combined with watertight compartments, the West Virginia is just about unsinkable. As the translator spoke in Japanese, Genda leaned to Fuchida and whispered, "The clever hawk hides his talons." "And who knows what the future holds?" Fuchida replied. Captain Belknap glanced over at the whispering two, who quickly smiled and nodded. Fuchida attempted his best English. "Very impressive." The next morning, the captain assigned Fuchida to escort a group of Japanese civilians, mostly farmers, who came to tour the Yakumo. San Francisco had one of the highest concentrations of Japanese anywhere in North America, and this was a rare opportunity for the immigrants to meet with some of their own countrymen. After following them up the gangplank of the aging gunboat, Fuchida, in his navy blues, led the group of simply dressed commoners beside one of their gun turrets layered with multiple coats of peeled paint. As they stood listening to Fuchida's little speech about the ship, the farmers kept looking off at the stately new West Virginia. One of the farmers pointed across the water. "Midshipman, are there any battleships like that in Japan?" "Yes, of course. We have a very modern fleet with brand new battleships, just like the American battleships." Fuchida smiled, carefully concealing his own feelings. "Then why didn't you bring one of those instead of this?" "It's so old, it's embarrassing. It'll only create more prejudice against use." "Well, you see, this is simply a training ship for young graduates." He paused. "What do you mean, more prejudice?" Another man with a round rice-field hat pushed forward. "They've passed laws against the Japanese, preventing us from immigrating here or owning land. Now we've lost our farms." Another blurted out, "And we can't even defend ourselves in court. We're not allowed to testify. It's not fair." Fuchida uncharacteristically spoke his thoughts. Why would they do that? Still, another pulled out several newspapers and waved them in the air. "Look at this. See what they write about us." Fuchida took the papers and with a shake flattened them out. Having made a point of studying English, he could easily read the headlines that shouted, "Japanese, a menace to American women," and "The Yellow Peril, how Japanese crowd out the white race." A wave of shock, disgust, and even fear came over him as he scanned the papers. From behind, one of the men tapped Fuchida on the arm and held out a matchbox. Fuchida turned to look at the matchbox, then quizzically at the man's face. The man then pointed at the wording on the box. "White men and women, patronize your own race." Fuchida looked out across the bay. Having come to the shores of the great United States for the first time in his life, he felt like he had been slapped in the face. The man with the rice-field hat continued, "We just want to farm and live our lives with our families, but I can't even bring my wife and children here to join me. It's as if they're saying that we're not welcome here, that we're not good enough. But why? We work hard. We don't bother anyone." "No one speaks up for you?" Fuchida asked. "A few American businessmen and some churches. But can't you do something?" The group all turned to look at Fuchida, ambushed by an ugly truth for which he had no response. His years of focused training at the Naval Academy had kept him from lifting his eyes to see the dark clouds gathering in the distance. After the tour, Fuchida stood upright on the dock at the base of the gangplank as the small group left, shaking the hand of each visitor and giving a slight bow, each likewise bowing in return. As the farmers continued down the dock, 3 young American sailors in their white uniforms, blue neckerchiefs and hats, cocked to just the right angle, approached from the opposite direction, towering over the Japanese farmers. The sailors came to an abrupt halt, looked over the aging cruiser, then at the men. "Hey, Chinaman! Ching Chow Yung Pang!" The farmers peered up at the sailor in confusion. "You call that a ship? We use stuff like that for target practice." Another sailor made hand gestures of guns shooting, then tilted his arm like a sinking ship complete with sound effects. His buddies snickered and shook their heads. Fuchida didn't hear every word, but he completely understood their message. The farmers looked back helplessly at Fuchida, his nostrils flaring like a caged animal being pelted with pebbles by ignorant, fearless children. 1931, Spring. The Deschutes River, Central Oregon. Jacob Jake DeShazer, a lanky blue-eyed boy of 19, stood fishing for steelhead trout along the boulder-strewn riverbank with his mother. He in his suspenders, a long-sleeved white shirt and a worn fedora. She in her typical long-sleeved dress covering her heavy frame. Green brush and craggy trees clung to the rocky banks that gave way to steep, arid hills of dead grass and high desert scrub. Though Jake loved the peaceful sound of the river and the distant birds, inside he wrestled with what on earth he'd do after he graduated high school and rehearsed how to fend off his stepfather's probing questions and lame suggestions he expected that evening. A trout tugged his line, darting through the clear water, as Jake instinctively pulled back. The line went slack. Jake jerked up his pole in frustration. That last one was a good 18 inches. Stupid fish. But smart enough to get away from you? His mum smiled, then paused. Have you thought about that offer from Mr. Jennings at the hardware store? There it was again. Jake knew she was fishing for more than just fish. Jake's dad died when he was 2, and his mother had remarried soon after, taking her second husband's name of Andrus. She was a tough woman, but not hard. Her words were kind, her love and affection true to the bone, and when she prayed at the table, Jake knew she meant it. To him, she was the epitome of what came to mind when someone talked of baseball, apple pie, and Mom. But there came a time when she needed to let him be a man on his own, and Jake felt that time was now. He doesn't pay anything, not enough anyway, he said. Jake liked his stepdad, a wheat farmer, but just wasn't of the mind to be a farmer himself. Well, something's better than nothing, and we could use the help. Mrs. Andrus pushed aside a wiry bush and carefully stepped over the rocks to reposition her line. Suddenly her pole yanked down, then up, as a trout churned the waters and splashed into the air. But not smart enough to get away from me. This one's coming to dinner tonight. The western sky glowed orange to purple above a low ridge of mountains silhouetting the Andrus' 640-acre wheat ranch against the sky, a collection of wooden farm buildings and a spinning wind pump. Fenced pens and barns housed 10 horses as well as a dozen dairy cows. The snort of a mare at the fence blended in with the warm sounds of family echoing from the glowing windows of their farmhouse. Seasoned fish sizzled in an iron skillet tended by Helen, Jake's 13-year-old half-sister, as the family took their seats at the table. Ruth, Jake's big sister, Glenn, just 2 years younger than he, and Hiram Andrus, his stepfather, who tucked a faded red and white checkered napkin into his collar and continued the press on Jake. What about Mr. McGregor's cattle ranch? You're good with horses, Jake. I suppose so. I can stop by there next week. Jake yanked the napkin from under his silverware, flapped it open, and laid it on his lap. Jake's mum lifted a tray with pot holders over their heads to the table. Make way for the cornbread. Right here. Glenn reached for a knife as the tray thumped the table and filled the air with the scent of sweet corn. Mrs. Andrus pulled off her mitts. Well, we've got to celebrate Jakey's graduation tomorrow. Glenn started cutting the cornbread. You sure he's graduating? Mr. Andrus replied, If he doesn't, we'll give him another try next year, and gave a wink at Jake, who punched Glenn in the shoulder. Mr. Andrus turned to Glenn. Don't you dare take a bite until your mother sits down and we give thanks. Glenn shouted, Helen, come on and sit down. Helen proudly carried in the platter of fried fish on blue and white stoneware as Jake turned to his mum, who was finally taking a seat at the end of the table opposite her husband. I want to save up and one day buy my own house, Ma. Maybe even build it. I want to build something that'll last. I just have to have the right job. Ruth poured herself a glass of milk. You couldn't build a chicken coop so you can forget about a house. Oh, stop, Mrs. Andrus said. You can do it, son. Now let's hold hands. The commotion at the table turned still as they reached for one another's hands and bowed their heads. The next afternoon, Jake and his fellow classmates of 13 students stood in their Sunday best on the steps of Madras High School for their class photo. The girls looked like they'd been waiting for this all year. The boys stood awkwardly as if they couldn't wait to get home to change. The photographer fumbled under his black drape. Hold it. Smile. Okay, got it. He ducked out from the cloth and stood up. Now go out and change the world. Jake rolled his eyes as the proud parents broke out into a smattering of applause. 1931, fall. The Kanto Gakuin School, Yokohama, Japan. The college campus stood empty, but the muted sound of singing flowed from the school gymnasium that featured a tall, square spire wrapped in ivy. 8 years after the devastating earthquake, the small school had been rebuilt and combined with another school. Inside, nearly 500 students sang a hymn in Japanese. A mighty fortress is our God. Although athletic, Jimmy was a pianist and a good singer too, a member of the glee club throughout his college years, but today he stood shoulder to shoulder with the students. Finishing the song accompanied by a small organ, Jimmy sang out in Japanese with his whole heart. He didn't just sing the words, he meant them. Let goods and kindred go, this mortal life also. The body they may kill. God's truth abideth still. His kingdom is forever. At his podium, Dr. Sakata bent the squeaky gooseneck microphone. Thank you so much. You are excused to classes. That evening, Jimmy hunched at a small desk below a wall of books, pecking away on a typewriter on his newsletter. Although his family of 5 lived in a small Japanese-style home with tatami mat flooring and sliding paper doors, they managed to squeeze in some Western-style furniture as well. Jimmy barely heard his 7-year-old son, David, screeching on his violin, or see Alice, 5, finishing a glass of milk at the kitchen table beside Charmer. Peggy, now 9, sat curled in a blue love seat, lost in a book. Jimmy continued at the typewriter, pausing now and then to adjust his glasses and roll up the sheet to read what he'd just typed. Charmer called from the kitchen. How are your freshman boys doing in English this year? Jimmy kept clacking away. Better than I'm doing in Japanese. Charmer studied a magazine and slowly rose from the table, still reading. Hey, you didn't tell me they published your article in the college paper. You didn't ask, Jimmy teased without looking up. Charmer squeezed into the love seat beside Peggy, who glanced up from her book. Peggy, listen to what your father wrote. Why do children work so hard in the fields at such a young age? Why do they work so hard in factories? Jimmy stopped typing to listen. Why are women and children allowed to be taken advantage of in factories to earn big profits for corporations? And why do we stand by and ignore these things? Jimmy spun around in his chair, pointing up an index finger with each hand. That reminds me. I'm taking some students down to the settlement tomorrow morning. Peggy jumped up. I want to come. Can I come this time? Jimmy reached out his hands and pulled her to his side. Of course. Everyone can help. The next day, Jimmy led a group of 9 student volunteers and a couple of teachers armed with backpacks, boxes and food pots into the slums of Yokohama. Known as the City of Tunnels because of its maze of buildings, shacks and alleys, it was overshadowed by the towering smokestacks of the Japan Carbon Company that layered the land in a film of soot, draining the colour from everything in sight the same way it seemed to drain the life of its inhabitants. Known as a den of drinking and brawling for the unemployed or underemployed, it smelled of industry and rotting garbage. Jimmy held Peggy's hand as he and the group of Japanese and Americans carefully plotted their steps on discarded planks that served as sidewalks through the muddy paths, trying to avoid the worst of the muck between the leaning wooden buildings. He bent down to Peggy. "These are our brothers and sisters." They trudged on as Peggy gazed up at stoic onlookers with folded arms in filthy rags. What might have repulsed others excited Jimmy. These were his people. Jimmy had co-founded this little settlement, as he called it, 2 years earlier, with school faculty and student volunteers through fund drives and donations. For him, faith meant nothing without works, and he diligently came to their little house in Yokohama every week, sometimes several times a week, with whatever people he could pull together. Rain or shine, summer or winter, he came. People from the slums sometimes came to his home in town where he and Charmer invited them in. When people realized that the Covels gave away food coupons, they'd often line up at their door before sunrise. The alleyway led to an opening where 2 Japanese students were already setting up tables in front of a new clapboard house displaying a sign in Japanese and English, Kanto Gakuin Settlement House. All are welcome here. "Good morning," Jimmy said as he set his backpack on the doorstep. "What are we doing first?" The others filed in behind him as the 2 students bowed. "Good morning, Koval-san. First, cleaning lice from hair, then math lessons, then Bible study. Night classes for the adults start again next week." A curious group of grimy children began to surround the small party and jostled each other while holding out their hands for food. One had open sores on his arms. Jimmy spoke in Japanese as he looked at the children. "Get your hair cleaned first, then you can have rice balls and pickles." The children sprinted for the tables with the washing bowls shouting, "Me first!" Some of the local adults stood at a distance, but Jimmy and the volunteers had earned the trust of others, who were quite friendly. He knew it would take time to earn their trust, and it was paying off. A student picked up a giggling child and carried him over to the table. Off to the side, Jimmy noticed a young girl about Peggy's age, standing with her head held low. Jimmy squatted down to her as Peggy came close and spoke in her best Japanese. "Would you like a pickle?" The little girl's eyes sparkled as she nodded. Peggy reached out her hand and said, "Don't be afraid. Come on, let's get your hair clean." The little girl looked up at Jimmy with concern, then to Peggy. Her face softened as she took Peggy's hand with a smile. January 7th, 1932. The Kashiwara Shrine Complex, 15 miles southeast of Osaka. Filled with joy and anticipation, Mitsuo Fuchida stood proudly in his ceremonial blue dress uniform, complete with sword, beside Haruko Kitaoka, meticulously adorned in a red embroidered kimono, her jet-black hair coiffed with combs. With her head humbly bowed, the two stood before a crowd of 60 guests in the Shinto shrine for their wedding ceremony. Having only been introduced to Haruko a month earlier, Fuchida had been in a whirlwind adventure. He was moved that his mother and father were rightly concerned with him having no wife and family, an oversight of the busy pilot of 29, so they arranged a meeting with a qualified young lady he liked from the beginning. Although engagement was usually 6 months, knowing that his next tour at sea could last a year, this tiger was in no mood to wait. As was his manner, he set his goals and quickly moved forward. Haruko was just who he wanted. The gentle, traditional gagaku music drifted through the room as the priest carefully poured sake into the third of 3 flat cups, held it up, then presented it to Fuchida, who took 3 small sips and bowed, returning the cup to the priest, who then held out the cup to Haruko. Fuchida put his days and nights of flying and sailing aside for the evening, and could see nothing and no one but his bride-to-be, who likewise took 3 sips and bowed to the priest. As she raised her head, he caught her eyes, and both did their best not to smile. The evening was filled with more music and much food, lots of it. With months of hard work laying ahead, he tried to make the most of every moment with Haruko, who now appeared beside Fuchida in a blue kimono. Wanting the time to last, he knew it would be over in the blink of an eye. To the delight of their guests, Fuchida picked up a large piece of broiled fish with his chopsticks and brought it up to Haruko's mouth as she smiled and shook her head. "Not satisfied," the guests shouted and cheered as Fuchida persisted. Finally, Haruko took a small bite of the meat to the applause of the guests and tried her best to chew while laughing. Yes, he thought, she is indeed the one. Spring, 1932. Yokosuka Naval Base, Tokyo Bay. Fuchida's light grey two-seat Mitsubishi B-1M biplane roared over the glistening water, unleashing its torpedo with a splash toward a barge marked with red flags. Fuchida directed his pilot to veer to the right, then tilt back left so he could look down just as a geyser exploded dead center on the barge. He smiled with satisfaction. On a shore platform, among other observers, Genta, now also a lieutenant, peered through binoculars. As he took down his field glasses, he, likewise, nodded with approval. The Yokosuka Naval Base near Tokyo specialized in training pilots in bombing techniques of all methods, including horizontal, high-level bombing and dive bombing, but Fuchida focused on their specialty, torpedo bombing. He was glad to see Japan strengthen its military power, as it long had interests in expanding its empire, especially into the recently acquired Manchuria area of China, renamed Manchukuo. He knew they badly needed to secure raw materials and other resources for what he saw as their right as the leading nation of Asia, and had no problem with their aggressive expansion. In 1910, the Japanese annexed Korea, a trophy from their victory over Russia in 1905, completing their piecemeal takeover of the nation through a series of shrewd reforms and disarming of the Korean military. This victory only whet the Japanese appetite for the prize of Manchuria, and in September of 1931, the Japanese army overran and seized that area as well. Fuchida's plane taxied down the airstrip beside a long row of biplanes boldly emblazoned with the blood-red Hinomaru, or sun circle. He wearily pushed up his goggles in his second seat as the pilot killed the engine and the prop sputtered to a stop. Mechanics in white quickly ran to grab the wings. Genda stood waiting with his hands on his hips, the binoculars still dangling from his neck, as Fuchida dropped to the ground from the wing and unbuckled his flight cap. Genda stepped forward. "Well done, Fuchi. You're gaining a reputation." "Genda, I heard you'd just begun teaching here. Congratulations." Genda put his arm around him and squeezed his shoulder. No, the congratulations go to the man who has taken a bride to preserve the Fuchida name." Fuchida blushed a bit and quickly changed the subject. "So tell me, what's new?" Genda cocked his head for Fuchida to follow. They approached a hangar where Genda nodded to a pair of soldiers who heaved open huge sliding doors. Stepping inside, Fuchida's jaw dropped. He'd heard about this plane but had never seen one. Before him sat a Mitsubishi, 1MF-10, the newest, fastest plane of a new generation of all-metal low-wing monoplanes. Mechanics attended to the aircraft like trainers of a thoroughbred racehorse. "I've already taken this test model out, and she's much faster and more maneuverable than any biplane. We're still working out imperfections, but this is the future of naval aircraft." "Okay, so when do I get a chance?" "As soon as possible, since you'll be training the pilots." "Me?" Fuchida did his best to act humble in the Japanese tradition, but he knew he fooled no one. "This is only the first of many superior aircraft that will be a part of the finest air division in the world. You're the best, and everyone knows it, especially you." The following day, Fuchida and Genda found themselves in the same room once again in a class for the last session of the day. Seated in rows with their hats sitting on their desks facing forward, the two friends were among a narrowing company of elite officers receiving the latest training from the best military minds in Japan. The instructor's voice seemed to grow more intense as he swung his arm across a huge map of Asia. The British colonized the subcontinent of India, the nation of Burma, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the Malay Peninsula. The Dutch have taken Indonesia with their rich supplies of oil and tin. The Australians occupy lands in New Guinea, and the Philippines are essentially a territory of the United States, who have built major naval and air bases there. Fuchida was engrossed. He'd never quite put it all together before in this way, but it rang true in his heart: conquer or be conquered. The teacher tilted his head down a bit as his eyes scanned the room of officers. The rich white Westerners are little more than proud colonists who subjugate native peoples. The money squeezed from Asian blood maintains these minorities in their wasteful lifestyles. Not only are they enslaving other nations and stealing their wealth, but they're doing it right in our own backyard, to our own fellow Asians. I've been to Shanghai, a home to many Westerners, where signs say, "Dogs and yellow people, no entry." Fuchida squirmed uncomfortably. It was just the same in San Francisco, something he could never forget. Yet these very same Western nations have the arrogance to insist that only the white races have the right to colonize, that we, under the leadership of our august and divine emperor, have no right to improve the conditions of Asians in Manchukuo. He slapped his hand flat on Upper China. Now a part of our growing empire, our rightful destiny. Fuchida's ears tingled, and his heart beat with excitement as the veneer of the West was stripped away to expose them as the culprits they were. Our goal is to stabilize East Asia through cooperation between Japan, Manchukuo, and China for our common prosperity. Since China, however, has ignored our true motives and has mobilized her armies against us, we can only counter her step by force of arms. Soon the nations will see the establishment of a new world order. He paused and looked over the room. East Asia will come to know economic prosperity free from the grip of Western colonialism. We will cleanse Asia from Anglo-Saxon expansion. Under our leadership, the 8 corners of the world will be brought together under one roof. The eyes of Fuchida were riveted on the professor, unaware of anything except the words pouring from his heart. The professor stepped away from the map and walked close to the officers in the classroom, the future leaders of Japan and her empire. We never forget that our lives belong to the emperor. We yield it to no one else under any circumstances. A true Japanese cannot surrender, as it is not in our nature to do so. There is no lower shame or contempt. If our enemies don't know this now, one day they will, and fear will grip their hearts. We bow to no one but to the emperor. The instructor stood tall and pulled his head back a bit. The United States is our enemy, so we will patiently let them mock us and lecture us and insult us with cartoons in their newspapers, and as they become weaker in their misplaced self-confidence, we will continue to become stronger. Soon we will have the most powerful navy on Earth. We will continue our military preparations and wait for the right opportunity to take our proper place in the world as the leading nation of Asia. Fuchida could see his anger beneath the surface. And finally, the West will be forced to give to the Yamato people what we have long deserved. Fuchida leaned to Gender and whispered, "Respect." The instructor quickly turned to Fuchida, stared, then looked across the class and nodded his head. Yes, indeed, respect. Spring 1932, Central Oregon. A layer of straw dust clung to Jake's sweaty face as the hay press chugged and clanked away against a weathered shed with a rusted corrugated roof. He adjusted his cowboy hat with his gloved hands and rushed to twist the second strand of wire onto a finished hay bale as others forked hay into the feeder. Another young ranch hand worked the levers and belts on the single-engine machine, sputtering unevenly, spitting puffs of smoke into the cloudless sky. The pot-bellied foreman pulled on the brim of his hat, looked down at his pocket watch, then up to the fading sun. "We're not lacing shoes, son. Get a move on." "Yes, sir. Fingers getting a bit sore." Jake grabbed the wires just as the bale was pushed out and swung it onto a trailer half full of bales, where another hand grabbed it and bucked it up into place. Easy for a fat boss standing around to tell us to move faster, he thought. Jake made up his mind not to farm wheat, but helping ranch cattle wasn't much different. The dry climate and poor soil didn't lend itself to much other than growing grass or raising creatures that ate grass. That was about it for the area.